The rain poured heavily outside the towering glass building of Lumina Enterprises, one of the most powerful corporations in the city. Inside, employees rushed past the lobby, too busy to notice the new security guard sitting quietly in the corner. His name tag read Daniel, a simple, forgettable name for a man who was anything but ordinary. Daniel adjusted his ill-fitting uniform, the fabric rough against his skin. His hands, once used to signing million-dollar contracts, now clutched, a cheap, half-broken walkie-talkie. He kept his head down, his dark eyes scanning the room from beneath the brim of his worn-out cap. No one paid him any attention, just as he wanted. Across the lobby, a group of receptionists giggled loudly, their designer heels clicking against the marble floor. One of them, a sharp-tongued woman named Vanessa, flicked her perfectly styled hair and smirked in Daniel's direction. "Ugh, look at him," she whispered loudly enough for him to hear. "Do they even pay him enough to afford a decent shirt?" Her friends laughed, their eyes raking over his scuffed shoes and faded pants. Daniel said nothing. He had endured worse in the past few weeks since he started working here, undercover, hiding the fact that he was Derek Lumina, the billionaire heir to the very company he now guarded. His mother, the legendary founder of Lumina Enterprises, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving him with a fortune and a final request. Don't marry someone who loves your money. Find someone who sees your heart. Those words haunted him. How could he trust anyone when his wealth attracted greed like moths to a flame? So he devised a plan. To disappear into the shadows of his own empire, to become invisible, and to see who would truly see him. His thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice spoke beside him. "Long shift, huh?" Daniel turned to see a woman holding out a paper cup of steaming coffee. She wore a janitor's uniform, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her smile warm and unguarded. Grace. He had noticed her before, the only person in the entire building who ever acknowledged him. She cleaned the floors with quiet diligence, often humming under her breath. Once she had even stopped Vanessa from dumping her lunch tray on his lap, saying firmly, "Be kind. You never know what someone's going through." Now, as he took the coffee from her, their fingers brushed slightly. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Grace tilted her head, studying him. "You don't talk much, do you?" Daniel hesitated. Talking was dangerous. The more he spoke, the more he risked being recognized. But something about Grace's eyes, kind, patient, made him want to break his own rules. Before he could reply, Vanessa's shrill voice cut through the air. "Grace, stop flirting with the help and get back to work." Grace rolled her eyes but didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she leaned closer to Daniel and whispered, "Don't mind them. They're just empty." Then, with a small wink, she walked away, leaving Daniel staring after her, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The days blurred together as Daniel settled into his role as the invisible security guard. He arrived early, left late, and spoke only when necessary. The employees of Lumina Enterprises barely glanced his way, except for Grace. Every morning, without fail, she would leave a small breakfast sandwich on his desk with a sticky note. That simply read, "Eat, you look tired." It was a kindness he hadn't expected, one that gnawed at him more than hunger ever could. One evening, as the office emptied, Daniel remained at his post, watching the last of the executives stride out, their laughter echoing in the polished halls. He was about to leave when he heard a muffled sound from the supply closet. Curious, he followed the noise and found Grace kneeling on the floor, her hands trembling as she tried to clean up a spilled bucket of water. Her sleeves were damp, her cheeks flushed with frustration. Without a word, Daniel grabbed a mop and began helping her. Grace looked up, startled. "You don't have to—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. She studied him for a moment before nodding, and together they worked in silence. When they finished, Grace exhaled deeply, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. Vanessa accidentally knocked this over before leaving, she muttered. She thinks it's funny to make my job harder. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had seen the way Vanessa and her clique treated Grace, mocking her for her simple clothes, whispering behind her back, even leaving trash in spots she had just cleaned. It infuriated him, but he couldn't reveal himself. Not yet. Instead, he asked, "Why do you let them treat you like that?" Grace shrugged, but her eyes held a quiet strength. "Because their words don't define me. I know who I am." She paused, then added softly, "And I know who you are, too." Daniel froze. Had she figured it out? His pulse quickened, but Grace only smiled. "You're not just some random guard, are you? You're different." He forced himself to stay calm. "What makes you say that?" She tilted her head, studying him. "The way you carry yourself. The way you watch people. Like you're seeing more than they want to show." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind. Maybe I'm imagining things." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Vanessa stood at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed. "Grace, the bathrooms on the third floor are a mess. Clean them. Now." Her gaze flicked to Daniel, her lip curling. "And don't you have somewhere unimportant to be?" Grace sighed, but nodded, grabbing her supplies. As she walked away, she glanced back at Daniel, her expression unreadable. He watched her go, his mind racing. She sees me. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't terrify him. The following week brought an unexpected shift in the office dynamics. Rumors had begun circulating about the upcoming company Gala, an annual event where executives and employees mingled under the glittering chandeliers of the Lumina Grand Ballroom. Vanessa and her clique were obsessed with the idea of meeting the elusive CEO, Derek Lumina, who had been absent since his mother's passing. They spent their lunch hours speculating about his appearance, his wealth, and, most importantly, how to catch his eye. Grace, as usual, remained silent during these conversations, scrubbing tables with quiet efficiency while Daniel observed from his post, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, as Grace emptied the trash bins near his desk, she paused and glanced at him. "You never told me why you took this job," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man like you could work anywhere." Daniel stiffened. "A man like me?" Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "You're different. You don't belong here." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken words. Daniel studied her face, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her brows furrowed when she was deep in thought. She was the only person in the entire building who seemed to look. Past the uniform, past the facade he had carefully constructed. It was unsettling, liberating, dangerous. Before he could respond, the office doors burst open, and a group of executives strode in, their voices loud with excitement. "The CEO is finally making an appearance at the gala," one of them announced. "He's been abroad handling business, but he's back, and rumor has it he's looking for a wife." Vanessa squealed, clapping her hands. "This is my chance." Her friends erupted into giggles, already strategizing their outfits and approaches. Grace, however, simply continued cleaning, her expression unreadable. Daniel watched her carefully. "You're not interested in meeting him." Grace let out a quiet laugh. "Why would I be? A man like that lives in a different world. He'd never notice someone like me." If only you knew, Daniel thought. That night, as he left the building, he made a decision. The gala was in 3 days. It was time to stop hiding. The days leading up to the gala were charged with an electric tension that seemed to hum through the very walls of Lumina Enterprises. Vanessa and her clique had transformed into a whirlwind of manic energy, poring over designer catalogs, practicing, their most seductive smiles in the bathroom mirrors and whispering vicious critiques about any woman they deemed competition. Grace, as always, moved through the chaos like a shadow, her head down as she mopped floors and emptied bins, her presence ignored by all except Daniel. He watched it all unfold from his corner, his fingers tightening around his walkie-talkie. Whenever Vanessa deliberately knocked over a cleaning cart or accidentally spilled coffee near Grace's feet. On the eve of the gala, Daniel found Grace alone in the break room, stitching a torn seam on her only dress, a simple navy blue piece she had clearly worn for years. She looked up when he entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "You're here late," she remarked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Daniel nodded toward the dress. "For tomorrow?" Grace's cheeks flushed. "It's silly. I'm not even going. Just thought I'd fix it anyway." Daniel hesitated, then sat across from her. "You should go." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "And do what? Stand in a corner while everyone else tries to claw their way to the CEO's attention?" She shook her head. "I'd rather stay home with a book." Daniel's chest ached. He wanted to tell her, to confess everything, but the fear of her reaction kept him silent. What if she hated him for the deception? What if she thought this was all some cruel game? Instead, he reached into his pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. Grace frowned. "What's this?" "Open it tomorrow," he said, standing abruptly before she could argue. He left the break room without another word, his pulse roaring in his ears. Inside the envelope was a single gala ticket, VIP access, the kind reserved for executives, and a note, "Wear the blue dress, it suits you." The night of the gala arrived, with a hushed anticipation that settled over the city like a velvet curtain. The Lumina Grand Ballroom glittered under a cascade of crystal chandeliers, their light refracting off champagne flutes and diamond jewelry as the elite of the company mingled in a sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. Vanessa and her friends had outdone themselves. Draped in couture and dripping with borrowed confidence, they perched near the entrance like birds of prey, scanning every arrival for a glimpse of the elusive CEO. Grace, meanwhile, stood frozen. At the edge of the ballroom, her fingers clutching the folds of her simple blue dress as if it might shield her from the judgmental gazes that flickered her way. She hadn't wanted to come, but something about Daniel's note had compelled her. Now, surrounded by opulence, she felt like an imposter. Across the room, Derek, watched her from the shadows of a private balcony. He was unrecognizable in a tailored tuxedo, his hair styled back, the sharp lines of his jaw accentuated by the dim light. His chest tightened as he saw Grace nervously adjust her dress, her eyes wide with quiet awe as she took in the grandeur around her. She was the only person in the room who wasn't performing, the only one who didn't belong, and yet the only one who truly did. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the orchestra paused, the lights dimming. It was time. Derek took a steadying breath and stepped forward. The moment Derek stepped into the light, a wave of stunned silence crashed over the ballroom. The air grew thick with disbelief as every head turned toward him. This wasn't just some guest, but the man they'd all been waiting for. The man whose face had been splashed across financial magazines, but who'd remained a ghost in his own company. Vanessa's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. Her perfectly painted lips parted in a soundless gasp as recognition dawned. Those sharp features, that commanding posture. This was the same man she'd mocked for weeks, the pathetic security guard she'd ordered around like a servant. But Derek's gaze never wavered from Grace. He moved through the crowd with the quiet certainty of a man who'd finally found what he was searching for, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in a rhythm that matched her accelerating heartbeat. Grace stood frozen, her mind reeling as the pieces clicked into place. The way he'd watched people, the questions he'd asked, the intensity beneath his silence. The truth should have felt like a betrayal, but all she could focus on was the warmth in his eyes as he stopped before her, closer than he'd ever dared as Daniel. The room seemed to hold its breath as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object, the worn security badge that had been his disguise. "You were right," he said, his voice low but carrying through the silence. "I didn't belong there. But you saw me anyway." Around them, muffled whispers erupted, as employees gaped, some already mentally scrambling to recall every interaction they'd had with the nobody guard. Vanessa's face drained of color as she clutched her friend's arm, her mind racing through every insult, every cruel joke she'd made within his earshot. Grace's hands trembled as she stared at the badge, then up at Derek's face. So familiar, yet suddenly, profoundly different. "All this time," she whispered, "you were testing us?" Derek shook his head, his thumb brushing over the badge's scratched surface. "I was honoring a promise. My mother believed love shouldn't come with a price tag." He glanced at the stunned crowd, then back at Grace, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "But you never even asked what I was worth." A choked sob came from Vanessa's direction as the reality of what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away with her own cruelty, hit her with brutal clarity. The women who'd spent weeks vying for the CEO's attention now stood paralyzed, watching as the man they'd dreamed of claiming reached for the one person they'd never considered competition. Grace's breath caught as Derek extended his hand, not with the flourish of a billionaire, but with the quiet uncertainty of a man laying his heart bare. "Dance with me," he murmured, "not as your CEO, just as the man you brought coffee to when no one else looked twice." The orchestra began to play. The music swelled around them as Grace placed her trembling hand in Derek's, the warmth of his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that belied the power he wielded in this world. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as he led her to the center of the dance floor, their footsteps silent against the polished marble. Grace could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her, some wide with shock, others burning with envy. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The man holding her was still the same quiet soul who had shared stolen moments of kindness in the break room, who had stood up for her without saying a word. The diamonds dripping from chandeliers above paled in comparison to the way his eyes reflected the light as he looked at her, as if she were the only real thing in a room full of illusions. Derek's hand settled at the small of her back. His, touch feather-light yet electric. "I thought about revealing myself 100 times," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the music, "especially when I saw how they treated you." Grace could hear the restrained fury beneath his words, the protective edge that made her pulse jump. He had watched. He had known. And soon, so would everyone else. As they swayed, the whispers grew louder. "That's the janitor," someone hissed. "How does she even know how to dance in that cheap dress?" The venom in the words made Derek's jaw tighten, his grip on Grace subtly possessive. She expected him to lash out, to put the gossiping crowd in their place with the cutting authority of a billionaire CEO, but instead he surprised her. With a deliberate turn, he guided her toward the orchestra and raised a hand. The music stopped mid-note. The silence was deafening. Derek didn't raise his voice as he addressed the room, but every syllable carried the weight of finality. "Many of you have spent years climbing over each other for a seat at my table." His gaze swept over Vanessa and her clique, now shrinking under his attention. "But tonight, I learned something important." He turned back to Grace, his expression softening in a way that made her breath catch. "The only person who deserves a place there is the one who offered me hers when I had nothing." A stunned murmur rippled through the crowd as Derek reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Grace's heart stopped. This wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning. The man who had hidden in plain sight was now laying his truth bare before the very people who had dismissed him, and in doing so, proving his mother right in the most profound way possible. As he dropped to one knee, the gasps around them were drowned out by the roaring in Grace's ears. The box opened to reveal a ring, not the cold, ostentatious diamond one might expect from a billionaire, but a simple band with a single emerald, the exact shade of her dress. "You loved me when I was invisible," Derek said, his voice rough, with emotion. "Now let me spend the rest of my life making sure the whole world sees you." Somewhere in the crowd, a champagne glass hit the floor for the second time that night. Grace barely heard it. The only sound that mattered was the word that tumbled from her lips, soft as a secret but strong enough to change everything. "Yes." And as Derek Lumina, the billionaire, the guard, the man who had crossed worlds to find her, slipped the ring onto her finger, the room erupted into applause. Not for the spectacle, not for the power play, but for the undeniable truth that even in a den of wolves, real love had found its way.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.